It's Micah Tyler, never been a moment. You're on Vision Christian Radio, Neil Johnson with you. It's the Thursday edition of 2020 and a conversation shortly I'll open talkback lines and invite you to join into. We're going to talk through some issues that might be very, very pertinent, very, very important for all who'll be listening in today. Because the dust is still settling on the controversy around the Essendon Football Club and the expectation that their newly appointed CEO, Andrew Thorburn, would need to choose between the club or his church. And as you will recall, Andrew Thorburn chose his church over his club. Well, woke organisations think that mainstream Christian values of marriage and family and a pro-life position on abortion disqualify you from holding key leadership roles. Since the Thorburn incident, Christians at all levels of workplace leadership have been asking questions about the implications of the decision that Andrew Thorburn was forced to make. Now, if being a Christian inhibits your prospects for advancement in your organisation, what should you do? Well, a conversation today with insights into the way you might have conversations in your workplace should you be confronted by the same challenging decisions. Our special guest, Wayne Forward, is the National CEO of Peacewise. It's an organisation that helps Christians, by God's grace, to apply peacemaking principles as a matter of stewardship, realising that conflict is an opportunity, not an accident. Wayne Forward, let me say a special welcome back to 2020.
Thank you very much, Neil. It's great to be with you again.
Wayne, we're going to be talking about healthy conversations in an uncomfortable workplace. Is this something that's on the rise, do you think?
I think it is. I think we are increasingly seeing the challenges of conversations that sit outside of kind of normative held positions in our culture as becoming more and more sensitive. And for Christians who hold often to what would be considered traditional and sometimes out of date beliefs around some of those moral issues in our society, it is becoming an increasing challenge in our workplaces.
Wayne, some say that the Andrew Thorburn incident is in some ways a new precedent. Your thoughts here? Is this a precedent that's been set? Are workplaces everywhere going to be adopting the same sort of woke attitude as the Essendon Football Club?
Yeah, I hope not. And I think we saw on the backlash of the Andrew Thorburn incident that there was a fair bit of pushback, I think. There was outcry from the Christian world of saying this isn't really right. But we saw that extend more broadly as well. We had former Prime Minister John Howard come out and make some statements, and other CEOs sort of said, hang on, we need to think about this. So whether it's set a precedent or not, I'm not quite sure we want to be able to go that far. But I certainly think that the incident highlighted to us that our culture's ability to accept someone who holds to what we might say are the mainstay traditional Christian beliefs around topics around things like sexuality and abortion, which are often sit different to our wider culture. The acceptance of those is becoming more challenged, and people don't quite see how it can fit together.
We might all agree, we hope it's not a general precedent that's set in workplaces around the nation, but there are going to be some wider ramifications. There are going to be some who are in middle management now and hoping to be elevated to some of those top executive level positions who might be a little concerned right now because they're working for a secular organisation and they will have known what the atmosphere is in their workplace as to how people responded when the Thorburn incident was, hot property in the press. What are your thoughts for wider ramifications?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you on that. I've had conversations with a number of friends that work in secular organisations and hold different levels of leadership, and it's certainly created questions. What do I say? Do I do I make a comment on Facebook? Do I like that LinkedIn post? Because the second you start making those statements, people will make judgments. They make assessments. And I think that the whole issue with Andrew Thorburn has raised for people that fear of, if people know where I stand around these issues at a personal moral level, will that hinder my chances of promotion? Will that hinder the opportunities of advancement that I'm hoping to be able to step towards?
Interesting, isn't it, as a development on the thought that some Christians are Sunday Christians, and, it's all about God on Sunday, but when I'm back to work on Monday, I hide my faith. I put it under a bushel, so to speak. I don't let my little light shine. People wouldn't know whether I'm a Christian in the workplace. They just think I'm just like one of the crowd, one of the secularized bunch. Any thoughts here as to how this situation may well have just pushed us into needing to take some sort of a stand in our workplace?
Yeah, I think this situation has highlighted that there are differences. We do think differently. And I think it does elevate for us an opportunity to be able to share with people, as Christians, we do think differently, but we can still relate well to one another. One of the things that I think can help us as we think about living in an increasingly, I would term it, a pluralistic society where we all think differently on different matters. One of the importance of a pluralistic society is actually the importance of proximity. What you don't want in a pluralistic society is the siloing of each different, I guess, group or communities that think a particular way. Because in our silos, we develop false notions in our minds about what the other is like. The workplace and our general community groups actually present a wonderful place where we're able to come near to those who think differently to ourselves. And by allowing ourselves to be known for the different things we stand for, actually helps people to realize that actually we can think differently, but still meet together.
Interesting to think about demonizing people in the workplace, because all of a sudden here we are, as Christian believers, concerned that we might be demonized because of some level of precedent set at the Essendon Football Club, and yet we might ourselves be guilty of demonizing others around us as well. And there's certainly going to be a level of Christian discrimination in a discriminatory sense, not altogether negative, that we need to be able to assess right and wrong, good and evil. But there's a certain fingers pointing back at us when we're pointing a finger.
Yeah, definitely. And I think you've raised two issues there. One relates to that element of demonizing, which you've mentioned there, and I think we need to be careful of that ourselves towards others. I think we can build false expectations or false assessments of those around us in the same way that others make of us. So I think that's something which we always need to be careful of. I think the other bit that you've raised in there as well is just that notion of that notion of getting to know the other, of being open to the idea that we do think differently on a particular matter. That's okay. We've reached a point, and I've discussed this in a recent article we published, this idea of acceptance and what acceptance actually means. And I think increasingly our culture is moving towards a place where acceptance is seen as accepting both the individual and also all of their beliefs. And that shift away from what might be considered a more traditional definition of acceptance, which is more etched around, we can accept the person but still be okay to think differently on certain beliefs. That shift towards a new definition of acceptance has made it is making it increasingly challenging to be able to be together and realize that we can think differently. And that's a really important thing for us to acknowledge. I think the bedrock behind healthy democracy and healthy pluralistic culture is actually a willingness to be able to do community and society together whilst thinking differently on particular matters.
I wonder if you've got any insights about general society, because as Christians, we'd like to think that believers, followers of Christ, have their beliefs, grounded in a bedrock, the rock that's not going to be moved, not on the shifting sand, but on the rock. So knowing what we believe, whereas perhaps the pluralistic workplace environment is full of people who are just being blown around by the cultural winds of the day. And so understanding what we believe about some of these mainstream Christian beliefs, and, when we're talking about marriage and family or a pro-life position on the abortion issue, which is what was, under scrutiny with the Essendon controversy, understanding what we believe is going to be a real start, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Definitely. I think part of our culture is obviously we're moving away increasingly from a Christendom type culture, one which holds to a biblical, or a scripturally informed normative laws and beliefs and values in our culture. We're into what's sometimes defined as a post-Christendom. And one of the things that changes with that is, I think historically, Christians haven't necessarily had to think critically around why they believe or hold to certain positions and values and so on, because that's been held normatively across our whole culture. But increasingly, as we move into a place where people think differently to what the large mainstream church's position holds to on things, it is critically important that as believers, we become more informed about why we believe what we believe, what it is that undergirds it, why we believe Scripture teaches these things, and be ready to be able to discuss those. But we want to be able to do that, obviously, as Scripture tells us. We want to be ready to be able to give an answer, but as we give that answer, we want it to be seasoned with salt, filled with love, and issuing grace and kindness as it is spoken to those around us.
Well, I do want to invite listeners to join into our conversation, and you might even have a workplace scenario that you've either witnessed or been a part of, where things are getting a little more challenging at work, perhaps even understanding that it's a little more difficult to apply for those upper echelon executive roles in your organisation or your department. Well, you might like to call us on 1-800-316-316. Love to be able to discuss a real-life scenario that a listener might have around this. You might even just reflect where your concerns might be around changes in the workplace right now. So 1-800-316-316 to join in our conversation. Our special guest is Wayne Forward. Wayne is the National CEO of Peacewise, fabulous organisation, peacewise.org.au. We're going to return to our conversation in just a few moments. Our talkback line is open on 1-800-316-316. Our special guest this hour is Wayne Forward. Wayne is National CEO of Peacewise. When we're talking Peacewise, we're talking peacemakers. In fact, a definition from the Peacewise homepage is a peacemaker is someone who's equipped to bring peace to conflict, restoration to damaged relationships, and the hope of Jesus in difficult situations. And if it's not you involved in a certain circumstance in your workplace, you may well be the peacemaker that helps two relationships that may well be damaged to be restored. 1-800-316-316 to join in our conversation. Wayne, let's take a call from Ruth in New South Wales. Hi, Ruth. Welcome along.
Oh, thank you so much, Neil. How are you?
I'm very well, Ruth. What's your thought, and do you have a sort of a scenario? How are you thinking about our conversation?
I think it's absolutely fascinating, and I don't have a scenario, But something that just kept coming to my mind as you were speaking was that it's a great opportunity to present our biblical worldview, because sometimes you can get into an isolated conversation about this or that or whatever, and without doing a whole great enormous spiel, you can say that you have a biblical worldview, that how you see things is biblically, and what God says and why we're in the situation that we are, or why people are thinking these different things, because people are thinking one way, quite respectfully, but we're thinking another way because we're thinking from a biblical point of view, and what we really care about is what God says in a certain situation. But we completely understand that other people don't feel the same way, but that's the point of view that we come from, because then you have a great opportunity to share the gospel, it just in whatever way the Lord opens up. That's just a thought that I had.
Ruth, you've made a wonderful contribution here, because, we could have our truth and righteousness foundations and attack people left, right and centre with those, the old Bible bashing mentality. I think you've got a different sort of an idea here, but the conflict creates the opportunity. Wayne Forward, what are your thoughts for Ruth?
Yeah, Ruth, I agree with what you're saying. I think it's a wonderful insight that you bring. One of the things which is key when we're having these sort of discussions with people is moving away from what we would refer to as just arguing the position, or arguing what even the question is that we're arguing over. That to really be able to have healthy conversations, we need to be able to move into what we refer to as talking through the interests. It's what it is that informs our positions on a particular issue. And what you're highlighting in saying that we want to be able to talk through and build an understanding of a Christian worldview is really kind of stepping into that place of wanting to move the conversations into the place of how we do see the world differently. And key to that is being able to explain that. So I think absolutely, really love your insight.
Ruth, while we've got you here, it's an interesting thing too, isn't it? That while everything is, calm and smooth in your workplace, nobody's having any sort of argument at all, you actually are stopped, halted from having an opportunity to contribute, because sometimes truth emerges when there is some level of conflict. How do you think about those things, Ruth?
I'll just give you a very quick scenario if you've got time. I was volunteering with an organisation in a hospital for about 26 years, and I didn't ever say anything about my beliefs or anything like that. But when a person was leading a thing in a room, a workshop, they would say to me, Ruth, if you could just go out of the room for a moment, we're going to tell some questionable jokes or something. I had never said anything, but somehow people knew that I wouldn't like it, and then they'd call me back in. It was a bit interesting, but I believe that the sweet perfume, the knowledge of Jesus, exudes from us wherever we need. But sometimes if we just, the presence of Jesus is there, that people realise that. And, sometimes it can be an opportunity for a question later. Well, how did you feel when you were out of the room, or whatever?
Ruth, it's interesting, isn't it, that when you're in a secular workplace, that people very quickly actually pick up your values just because of your behaviour and your habits and the things that you do on the weekend. The fact that you might go to church, people pick up that you are a Christian. And so, yes, some people are going to be respectful of you, and if they're, telling a few blue jokes, they might say, you might not want to be here and you might want to go out of the room. So that's actually a sign of respect from your workmates over that long time there, Ruth. But a thought or two further to that. Wayne, your thoughts on what Ruth is sharing?
Yeah, I mean, it's lovely in some sense, isn't it? That respect was shown, that through her presence. I mean, it says something, Ruth, something about you. People understand where you sit on your worldview and beliefs, it would seem. And there was that, as you've rightly said, Neil, there's a sense in which they were showing respect. They wanted to be able to go in a different way that might cause offence, and so they excluded that. It's interesting. I think we do see, and we do live in a culture that does want to and values respecting the other. Some recent research from McCrindle Research that was looking at acceptance and so on actually pointed towards that. Part of the research showed that respect is something that Australian culture does value, does want to continue to be present. Where the challenge of it lies in this space is, how do we show respect towards one another, and where does respect and acceptance begin and end when we think differently, and particularly over some of these more contentious issues? That's where the challenge really lies.
Ruth in New South Wales, thank you so much for a great contribution. 1-800-316-316. If you'd like to join in our conversation, you might have a question, a comment, even a critique for the conversation. About 4 minutes to the news. Let's just talk about maybe some practical things, preparing ourselves, Wayne, for those healthy conversations around our concerns that we might be seeing in the workplace.
Yeah, I think there's a few different ways that we can prepare ourselves for these conversations. One is, which we've already touched on, is making sure that we're actually aware of what we believe and why we believe it, more importantly. Of actually being able to process through and put some words to the reasons for our beliefs. Because it's one thing to say, I believe X. It's another thing to be able to clearly and articulately explain why it is that we hold to that. So I think that would be one thing, is trying to put some words and understand why we believe what we believe. I think the other bit of it then is also recognizing and preparing ourselves that not everyone is going to agree with us. We often, in our church worlds, on our Sundays and so on, we can unintentionally find ourselves in something of an echo chamber where we just hear what we want to hear. We hear others that think similarly along our own lines, preparing ourselves to recognize as we are in our workplaces and these topics come up, of recognizing that not everyone will think the way we think, and being prepared to be able to hear differences of opinion and preparing ourselves to then listen well to why the other people might think differently to ourselves. We can be quick to shut down. Instead, we want to be able to prepare ourselves to listen well. And part of that is thinking through, what questions might I ask of the other person to be able to better understand where they're coming from. Not because we suddenly want to change our positions, but because we genuinely want to be able to hear them. And because that's a way of loving, it's a way of honouring, it's a way of respecting, it's a way of being humble towards the other person and showing grace towards them as well.
Powerful concept, because it puts extra pressure on the shoulders of the Christian believer, doesn't it? Because not only do we need to be across the detail and knowing what and why we believe what we do, but we also have to understand why people believe the other way. We have to understand where they're coming from. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And preparing ourselves to be able to have those conversations. We might not necessarily know all of the other arguments that someone else is going to raise with us, or reasons for why they hold to a particular way. And that might be helpful at different times, but a lot of the time we just want to be able to prepare ourselves to be able to have these conversations, to be able to listen well, and to accept as we do listen that there is history with our church to say that we haven't always done well in honouring others who think differently to ourselves. The Royal Commission, for example, is a stain, isn't it? It highlighted the brokenness of the church and the wrongs that we've done. And we need to be ready to be able to hear that and accept that comes with some consequences. People are less trusting of the church. They're skeptical around when Christians believe that they can think differently and still love somebody. We need to be accepting of that as well. So as we're having those conversations and being okay to to take some rightful criticism of the church.
So be quick to acknowledge that there are wrongdoings of the church that have happened of recent times, and some will even point out throughout the last history of 2,000 years. So aware of those things, ready to admit the wrong, but then also being able to hold your own in a conversation in a peace-wise way. We're going to continue our conversation after Vision National News. Talkback line open, 1800 316 316. Wayne Forward is our guest, National CEO of Peacewise in Australia. Back with more after news. Great to have you with us on this Thursday edition of 2020. If you're just joining us, joining into a conversation about how to have healthy conversations in an uncomfortable workplace. The dust is still settling on the controversy around the Essendon Football Club and the expectation that their newly appointed CEO, Andrew Thorburn, would need to choose between the club or his church. As you'll recall, he chose his church over his club. Woke organisations think that mainstream Christian values of marriage and family and a pro-life position on abortion disqualify you from holding key leadership roles. Well, since the Thorburn incident, Christians at all levels of workplace leadership have been asking questions about the implications of the decision that Andrew Thorburn was forced to make. If being a Christian inhibits your prospects for advancement in your organisation, what should you do? A conversation today with insights into the way you might have conversations in your workplace should you be confronted by the same challenging decisions. Our special guest is Wayne Forward. Wayne is the National CEO of Peacewise in Australia, an organisation that helps Christians, by God's grace, to apply peacemaking principles as a matter of stewardship, realising that conflict is an opportunity, not an accident. Our talkback line is open on 1800 316 316. You can call through. You might even have your own scenario around the sorts of things we're talking about today. We'll take another call in just a few moments. But Wayne, before we do, the thought that things have changed and are changing very rapidly, and society is forming its own views around acceptance and tolerance. This is something we have to be able to grapple with, accept, and understand how we navigate a way forward under that.
Yeah, definitely. It's been interesting. There's a fair bit of sociology kind of around and research around the way that acceptance, or sometimes it's referred to as tolerance, is viewed and understood in our culture. And the research that is coming out, and has been over the last decade or so now, is really highlighting that there is a change in the way that tolerance or acceptance is viewed. The classical or I guess traditional way that tolerance and acceptance has been seen has been, sometimes it's kind of best summarized by Voltaire's very famous quote that says, I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend your right to say it. It's that idea that we might think differently, but we want to be able to have an environment in which we're each able to share those differences. But recent research, the most recent that I've read, it came out earlier on this year by a group here in Australia called Mainstream Research. They showed that only 38% of our culture now actually hold to that position of defining acceptance and tolerance in that way. The bulk of people, 55%, rather start to frame and understand those acceptance and tolerance by a view that says, actually, we accept not just the person, but we also accept their view, their way of thinking around the world. The place of judgment of whether that is right or wrong is suspended. And so that subtle shift actually removes a tolerance, if you like, to thinking differently. And we saw that play out in the Andrew Thorburn. It's one of the reasons I would suggest why it was seen as not acceptable, that he might personally hold to some positions, but be able to be part of a club that took a very, I guess, a more secular or or acceptable view from a cultural perspective around issues of sexuality and so on.
Taking calls, 1800 316 316. Let's hear from Andy in Victoria. Hi, Andy. Welcome.
G'day, how you doing?
Very well, Andy. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, look, I just wanted to share a story of my own. I've always been somebody who's taken, brought God into my workplace, each and every day. And I've tried to make my decisions based on, what I believe in everything that I do in my workplace, even if it's not necessarily, overtly obvious. I had a situation where I was employed with an organisation for nearly 5 years, and 4 of those years are amazing. But at the end of the fourth year, and we were doing a big project, and they said to me, we got some advice around, needing a lot of extra people, and they decided not to, get those people for this project. And they said to me, look, you're going to need to do a lot of stuff, and it's going to involve an enormous amount of your time. And I said, look, I'm happy to do my best. But, my family comes first. I had a child with special needs, and I had to choose between my family and my beliefs and doing this project. And when I expressed that, things started to go sour. And my boss made up some charges against me and was in, good friends with the HR person. And, at the end of the day, I actually ended up getting some advice around, what was right. And I was actually probably had a good case against them to take them to court and win. But I really felt God clearly tell me, just shake the dust off your feet and move on. And that's exactly what I did. And in actual fact, God blessed me with an amazing opportunity and a job post that situation. But I just feel it's really important to take God into our workplace and listen to what he's got to say about every situation and stand up for our values.
Andy, thank you for calling through with your own story there. Let's get a thought or two from Wayne. How do you respond, and how do you talk about Andy's situation?
Yeah, well, Andy, let me start off by saying, obviously, sorry to hear that you navigated that situation, but want to be able to commend you on it sounds like the way you conducted yourself in both seeking to listen to God in the midst of that, and also to remain solid in your convictions around what it means to be a father, a godly father, godly husband, to be able to care for your family in that as well. The truth is, of course, in our workplace environments, we are often called to choose and to make decisions in that. And sometimes they're going to be costly. And I guess Andy has just shared the cost of standing up for that. I think we're reminded in Matthew, aren't we, that even when we are peacemakers who are called children of God, which we're told is blessed, the very next verse after that says that we are also going to be persecuted for righteousness. Even when we do seek to conduct ourselves in a way that is peacemaking, as we share our thoughts and beliefs respectfully and lovingly with those around us, there are still going to be circumstances where that isn't accepted. We need to be ready for that. That's okay. We've been warned about it. Just promised us that he is with us in the midst of those difficulties, but we do need to be prepared to face that.
And Andy, while you're on the line, interesting that you make a reference to shaking the dust off your feet when you felt unwelcome in your workplace, and drawing attention to that scripture, which is largely about inhospitality. And Jesus was being asked, about, what happens in these circumstances where you're rejected. And it was Jesus' words, shake the dust off your feet. In actual fact, he went on to say from that, and this might be a warning to the secular employer that decides that the Christian employee is not good enough, and they decide to shake the dust off their feet. He said, worse for you will be the punishment than what was for Sodom and Gomorrah. So there's a bit of a warning there, and there's a little bit of there's a bit of tough stuff coming from God himself about how things happen for people who reject you as a believer. Now, I'm just taking a big sideline here, but any thoughts on that, Wayne?
Yeah, I mean, I think we do worship a God who is sovereign, and he has put together a system for our world to live in, which is the best for us. And he does give us warning when we step away from that there are consequences to that. I think the thing for us to be able to keep in mind is that God, even while we were still kind of in rebellion, it was in that space that he sent Jesus out to extend that arm of relationship, of the opportunity to find forgiveness through Jesus Christ. And so whilst we hold on to that notion and that idea that God will certainly bring justice in the future, and there is a place to be able to remind people of that warning, we need to continue to extend that arm of love and invite people to be able to hear us and invite people to hear what God has to say into our situation.
Andy, thank you so much for your call. Our talkback line open on 1800 316 316. Yes, a mistake to get into being a little vindictive and saying, well, God's got my back and expect his judgment anytime soon. But the thought that you've got to be able to adjust in your workplace and love people in your workplace, even though they might not be tolerant or accepting of you. There is something here because love is a really powerful thing that brings about transformation and change in itself. Thoughts here about how you actually do that, Wayne?
Yeah, I think part of it is about recognizing that we're not alone. God is with us in these hard spaces. When we just try to do it on our own steam, it can feel overwhelming. But when we can recognize and hold on to some of those promises that God gives us, Jesus says he's not going to leave us. He's with us to the very end of the age, that we are given his Spirit who gives us the right words to say, of recognizing that even if we get the wrong words, that we bumble over our words a little bit at different times, God is able to use that in the right and helpful ways for people as well. And so I think reminding ourselves of that, I think also in the midst of that as well, is recognizing that we can also lean on our friends and our communities to help support us in that space. When we do find ourselves in those hard positions of asking the communities that we are part of and our churches to be able to support us and care for us, give us advice. What would others say into those positions as well?
That's a really powerful point. What happens in that small group that you're a part of, or your local church, the community, the men's group or the women's group, those sorts of support networks, sometimes we think they're just a social gathering, but actually when we're going through a hard time, that's where we want to be able to glean and gather some strength to be able to face those challenges, the adversity in the workplace. So a very, very important point. Just to enlarge on that, the local church, it's an important place. It's not just a club. It actually is something that is vital for life, vital for being able to have that support network. What are your thoughts around the local church and relying on your church in times of need, Wayne?
I think it's a really, really important part. In our workplaces, we can often face those challenges. We've heard that from Andy when he called in a moment ago. I've certainly got plenty of friends that share similar testimonies and stories along those lines. But it's in our community that we're able to find that encouragement. Hebrews talks about not stop meeting together in order so that we can be encouraged in this place. It's as we gather together that we can be resourced, we can equip to help us understand some of the reasons that stand behind our positions and beliefs on things. And it's also in those places where we're able to have a place where we can, I guess, be vulnerable with others and still accepted as we think differently to our wider culture that we live within.
Recognising as things are changing, Wayne, it's a point now where it is getting to the place where corporations are telling us what we should believe. Now, we might be able to name all sorts of corporations. I'm thinking Qantas as I'm framing a thought around this, and employees who've all of a sudden had to toe the party line on various woke issues and being told what they should believe. It gets harder and harder when the corporation actually sets the agenda for what you must believe and how you must behave.
Yeah, definitely. And I think as a culture, we're still trying to figure this out. I know that in the wider commentary around freedom of beliefs, there is discussion at the moment around the idea of a Bill of Rights or at least an anti-religious discrimination bill and so on. To be able to etch into our culture the freedoms that we need to be able to think differently on these. And we're seeing some of the backlash of, I guess, in sport particularly, when we're seeing organisations and corporations start to enforce onto people what they may need to uphold or advocate for. And so we've seen things, for example, in the NRL, the whole issue around Manly Sea Eagles, as players were asked to wear the pride jersey. A number of them stepped back and said, actually, that's a line that we're not willing to cross. We've seen it emerge not out of religious areas, but even more recently in the netball, around when an organisation and players think differently to what their governing body do over particular issues. And I think as a culture, we're in a state of flux of knowing where that pendulum sits. But in a society which is really wanting to value difference, that values and upholds and advocates for people to hold and think differently on particular issues, we need to be really careful when we start to enforce where those boundary lines are on individual positions.
Let me just mention, I wrote a book and released it this year. It's called Public Christians in a Secular Age, and it deals a little bit with these sorts of changes that are happening, because when we talk about the way secularisation has taken a hold in Australia, it's described as something like a structural eclipse. So you can imagine an eclipse of the moon the moon coming in face of the sun, and so the sun that was shining brightly is being blocked by the moon. Things changing very dramatically. And what I've advocated for is a way out of the eclipse, which I hope starts a conversation about moving forward from these things rather than just wallowing in the challenges. But one of those things we do in the organisations that we're a part of is that we help to set a culture which has, the mission of God at the centre of what your organisation does. And this really comes down to Christian leaders of organisations, but the people who are a part of organisations, they can be a part of shaping the culture within. So in some sense here, and your thoughts, Wayne, on the way that you might be in that middle management area, looking forward to an upper echelon job eventually, helping to shape the culture now so that you've got a way forward to move up the ladder. Any thoughts here?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, a large part of what Peacewise talks about is actually building cultures of peace. And a key part to that is recognizing that we have a really rich opportunity to be able to influence culture as Christians, to be able to love, to be able to care, to be able to exercise that kindness towards others, that grace towards others, and being proactive of seeing that our presence in our workplaces is not just about getting what we need to get done. We've got deadlines to meet and so on, but actually the way we conduct ourselves is key and important as followers of Jesus. We are called his ambassadors, and we exercise that a lot about not in the just getting the job done, but in the way that we get the job done. And as we do that in a distinctly different way that's informed by Christ's love, we have the opportunity to steer people to see the difference that Jesus makes. And I think in this whole place, this discussion around acceptance and tolerance and so on, we have the opportunity to say, we want to do the discussion differently. We don't want to just finger point and say, you think differently, therefore you have to be out. We can't listen to you. There is no place of acceptance for you. We actually want to be able to conduct ourselves differently. I'll be able to say, yes, we might think differently, but as people who are created in the image of God, we still welcome all people. We want to understand and journey with you in life, even where we do think differently.
You know, as I think of Peacewise and happily saying to listeners, I've sat through some training from Peacewise. It is really amazing. It's outstanding training. It helps you to be able to navigate those difficult issues that you might find in your workplace. And you know, what happens even in your local church? You can have conflict all over the place, but you can get some really good grounding in principles, being able to navigate that conflict resolution. But not only that, Wayne, you can become the person who is a mediator between others who are having conflict as well. This is something that you work very hard on. You work with organisations, you work with churches. How can people access some of the wonderful training that you do?
Yeah, absolutely. I thank you for the encouragement and the favour by the way you described it there, Neil. But yeah, if you are interested in thinking around how to be trained as a peacemaker through us, check us out on our website, www.peacewise.org.au. You can go to our Peacewise U page and you'll find a whole lot of information around our training, both around personal peacemaking, as well as going on to do what we call conflict coaching or mediation training, where you can be equipped to be able to help others navigate conflict themselves.
Wonderful stuff. And there's Peacewise for adults that we might be talking to today, but there's Peacewise Kids and Peacewise Youth. You've got some programs for young ones, children, coming up into teenage years and even before they hit those adult years. What a wonderful discipleship method that is. So if you're actually, introducing something like this into a children or a youth ministry, how does that work too?
Yeah, absolutely. We're really proud of a curriculum that we have, Peacewise Kids, Peacewise Youth, that teaches biblical peacemaking to children all the way from ages 4 up to 25. You can find information out on that in our website. We work in churches using that curriculum. We're also working in schools right across Australia and now even into the US as well, in teaching children how to do biblical peacemaking. And one of the things that motivates us to that is just that idea of, man, if I could have known how to be a biblical peacemaker as a child, how different that would have made my teenage, my young adult years, how it could have influenced workplace kind of issues that we've encountered in the future as well. Please check it out, Peacewise Kids, Peacewise Youth.
Great organisation, peacewise.org.au. You've probably got nothing to lose and everything to gain by understanding some principles that they share in that training. Peacewise.org.au. And Wayne Forward is the National CEO of Peacewise. Wayne, thanks so much for sharing your heart with us today on 2020.
Thank you so much for having us again, Neil.